International Relations, podcast lecture number 8, Ethics. International relations and ethics have for a very long time had a highly tense and uncomfortable relation. Throughout most of the 20th century, international relations actually was a field that did not want to embrace a lot of ethical thinking, and its main theories were also very unhospitable for ethical judgment calls. So, obviously, in the case of realism, ethics are relatively unimportant, understood in terms of national interest, understood in terms of power. Right. So, from a realist perspective, what is ethical to do is actually to act on the basis of interest by using power. This does not mean that there is no space whatsoever for ethical considerations in realism. Particularly classical realism did take serious efforts to develop the idea of the ethical puzzles that a statesman has to work his way through when making judgment calls about what to do in certain situations, and particularly the idea of virtuous action, the idea of making the best call, making the best judgment. That is sort of an echo from Machiavelli's The Prince, in which virtù was the ability to make the right decision at the right time, was still being considered to be a very important aspect of statesmanship. But overall, these are of course marginal issues compared to the big question of power politics, and for a realist, power politics is just what it is, and there is no ethics to ground it in. Liberalism is generally understood to be much more hospitable to ethics, in the sense that it's much more optimistic about the ability of humans and human actors to actually act together and create joint solutions for shared problems. So from a liberal perspective, the state of nature is not an end state that we are just in, but we are able to create something like social contracts through which we can create organizations such as democracy, but also international organizations that help us to overcome the war of all against all, and to create better, more social and more equitable outcomes. So in the liberal perspective, there is something of an ethical form of progress. But it should be noted that this is very limited in many ways, particularly in the sense that for a liberal, human cooperation between actors, only takes place on the basis of strict rationality, strict calculation. Meaning that there is nothing going beyond an interest kind of based thinking, an instrumental use of cooperation to further one's goals. There is no empathy, there is no altruism, there is no ethics of care, so to say. There is only instrumental use of the other, which is of course a very clear horizon or limitation of liberals' account of ethics. In the case of Marxism, the picture is even more dire, because for a Marxist, what ethics are basically the product of historically developed social relations. And this implies that universal values, universal ethics, such as human rights, basically represent the values of a certain dominant class. And therefore they are not universal at all. So from a Marxist perspective, ethics are something to be very suspicious of, because they serve specific purposes, interests, and goals, and particularly they serve specific groups that profit from them in many ways. So from a Marxist perspective, ethics in a sort of a true way can only come through social change, through social turnovers that produce a new social reality. This kind of relation with ethics, between ethics and IR theory in the 20th century has led to a situation in which ethics were very poorly valued in the discipline. And up to the 1980s, you see very little attention for ethics in international politics. One of the reasons for it, apart from the theoretical perspectives that we just discussed, is the fact that ethics was understood to be something of the antithesis of science, where on the one hand we have an understanding of IR as a scientific discipline in which we just study the world as it is and try to be as objective as possible, and this was sort of countered with the other side of the story, which is the set of ethical puzzles and conundrums that international relations sails through, right? And for IR discipline, ethics was something that was done more in the humanities and not so much in the IR side of things. This was, of course, aggravated by the fact that the Cold War made us understand world politics already in terms of conflict, competition, bipolar logics, etc., etc. And that therefore ethical puzzles seemed very, very far away from the daily reality of politics. Obviously, one could protest Vietnam, one could protest the power politics as they were there, but this game was continued to be played forever and therefore so immutable that very few serious scholars actually dared to question their ethical functioning. Obviously, there were some exceptions to this, and Michael Walzer is certainly the most famous of those. His book, Just and Unjust Wars, was and still is a magnificent study in what creates legitimacy of warfare and within warfare. What makes wars right and what makes them wrong, what makes behavior within warfare right or wrong. But he was one of the very few. Only in the 1980s, when critical theory and post-structuralism slowly started to rise, do we see a renewed appreciation of ethics in international politics. Critical theory and post-structuralism argued that the idea of an objective science is complete nonsense. We are never neutral. We are always speaking from a perspective, and each perspective that we have is going to help certain groups, certain interests, certain goals, and make other groups' interests and goals more difficult. In other words, whatever perspective we have, we are always somehow political. And playing the objective science card is just another way of strengthening certain kinds of cultural hegemony having to do with science, with objectivity, with Western forms of knowledge, with Enlightenment thinking, etc., etc., etc. So on the basis of this idea that knowledge is never value neutral, and therefore that whatever position we have in international relations, we're always going to further a certain set of values, Both structuralists and critical theorists argued that we should be as explicit as possible about our normative position and actually include the normativeness of our perspectives in our actual analysis. This only took up seriously after the end of the Cold War in 1990, and it became increasingly popular inside of, but also outside of the IR academic discipline. Even in the policy world, you see a strong shift from a Cold War logic to a logic in which ethics are being integrated in existing policy puzzles. So, during the 1990s, you see, for instance, United Nations shifting their policy proposals and their policy repertoires from government or governance to good governance, explicitly linking it with ethical considerations. Simultaneously, the concept of security is shifted towards human security in order to accommodate all kinds of ethical puzzles that fall off the radar if we take too narrow an understanding of what security is. And you see an increasing interest in the ethical puzzles of globalization. This intertwinement of globalization and ethics takes place in different ways. To begin with, sovereignty itself is already an ethical puzzle. The idea that we have states that are mutually exclusive, in the sense that if you are part of one state, you are not part of another state, creates all kinds of ethical issues. This has most famously been articulated by R.G.B. Walker in his famous book Inside Outside, published in 1993, where he shows how the sovereignty system, the system of sovereignty, creates ethical spaces, states, that are divided along the lines of their insides and their outsides. And that within the state, ethical rules apply. And ethics are actually a guiding policy principle. But outside of the state, it is a anarchic system that is conducive to competitive and zero-sum games, all about power and survival. So the sovereign system distributes ethics along lines of insides and outsides, such that communities do not relate ethically to one another, but only to themselves, but identify non-ethically to one another in terms of competition and power struggles. But also within states, you see that the ethical is played out in certain ways, because the state system tends to homogenize the population it rules, right? So if you are part of a state, you are firstly a citizen, and only after that you are a cultured person. And this means that you are being uniformalized into a certain ethics of citizenship, meaning that cultural differences within states are being downplayed, minimized, and even repressed in order to homogenize populations into state citizenship. So the global, the system of sovereignty itself distributes ethics along lines of insides and outsides, which has negative consequences on both sides. And globalization complicates this puzzle even more. If we understand globalization as a increasing interconnectedness, the ability to transfer goods and people across the globe in an incredible short period of time, flows of money that are uncontrollable by states, then the ethical puzzles that states face are increasingly complex and unoverseeable. And the tensions that are generated within sovereignty are huge and are of an enormous social impact, but are not under control of anybody or any state in particular. Moreover, under globalization, we see a process in which has been described by Ulrich Beck in his book Power in the Global Age. Risks are being globalized in the sense that processes that are dangerous to us, such as environmental change, global warming, etc., 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 those risks are being globalized, meaning that they are no longer under control of the states themselves. But our security systems, our laws, for instance, are still to a large extent confined to the state system. So we see a globalization of risk, but a state system that has to manage that somehow. And this leads to a situation in which particularly weaker states fall prey to the risks that are generated elsewhere on the globe without an ability to actually counter those risks in a meaningful way. Now, simply said, we in the West have the ability to outsource the risks of our decisions to the third world, and we do not have to carry the burden of those risks. Another aspect of normative theory that is important here is decision making. How do we know whether our decisions are good or bad, are ethically justifiable or not? In order to think about these kinds of decision puzzles, ethical theory has developed two main positions on what makes a decision justified or not. On one hand, we've got consequentialism, and on the other hand, we've got deontology. And both are logics of ethical action. Roughly, it plays out as follows. In consequentialism, basically what one does to make a just decision is calculate the expected outcome of an action and then see whether that outcome is positive or negative. If the outcome is positive, we'll just do it. If it's negative, we won't do it. It's a very clear analysis based on the consequences of our own action. This sounds commonsensical enough, except that it completely overlooks the element of ethical principles. The fact that sometimes you could want to act regardless of outcomes, right? Simply because you want to act in a certain situation. This is the deontological position, which is the idea that you should act on the basis of ethical duty regardless of what the outcome of that action might be. So here the idea is, well, if a situation is just too horrible, I'm not going to sit and contemplate, calculating what might be the dangers of me interfering with that situation. I'll just act and do the right thing, right? So this is called deontology because the word deon in Greek means duty. It's duty-based understanding of ethical action. This has been most explicitly articulated by Immanuel Kant in his famous categorical imperative. Roughly translated in two ways. Firstly, always act so that you would want others to act in the same situation. So always act in such a manner that you would have that manner be applied as a rule to others. So the idea here is that you make a decision based on a logic in which you say, okay, in this situation I would always want all people to act in this or that manner, and therefore I will act in that manner now. And the other way in which the categorical imperative is usually translated is by saying always treat others as an end, never as a means. Don't be instrumental in your use or in your engagement with other people. The advantage of the categorical imperative is that it creates very clear guidelines for behavior. But of course, the disadvantage is that it might be very difficult to actually articulate what it would mean for a certain action to act so that you would want all others to act similarly in that situation. Right? Particularly in international politics, there are very few situations in which such clear categories would actually apply. Apart from decision making, there is a lot of discussion in the ethics and IR community about the applicability of ethical norms, and particularly the generalizability or the universalizability of ethics. Here too we've got two contrasting positions. On one hand we've got Cosmopolitanism, and on the other hand we've got Communitarianism. Cosmopolitanism is roughly the universalist position, arguing that we are all human beings. There is a shared humanity that we all have. We have the same ethical foundations as humans. But sovereignty blinds us to that shared humanity because it pits communities against one another. So therefore we should try to overcome the boundaries of sovereignty, not by destroying the state, because that will be very difficult to do if desirable at all, but rather by getting together as a global civil society in a non-instrumentalist way, articulating our own values in a clear and friendly manner, and discussing, having a dialogue, that would be a better way, having a dialogue about our shared values. And from below trying to articulate a global civil society that becomes part and parcel of the polity, of the political process in due time. The other side is communitarianism, which is much more relativist, and which argues against the idea that in the end we share a shared humanity, which implies that we have universal core values. Communitarianism actually argues that ethics aren't a universal blueprint that can be put over peoples, but rather that ethics come out of community practices. What I think is valuable is not a category that is above me, but comes out of the community and community practices that I grew up in. So all ethics are necessarily local. This has led to a very extensive and ongoing discussion between the communitarianists and the cosmopolitanists, in which communitarianism would attack cosmopolitanism on usually a set of arguments starting out with the idea of, well, what would happen if you decide on certain kind of ethics as intrinsically human and therefore universal? What if people would oppose those values? Would you repress them? Would they be wrong? Would they somehow need correction? Because this would imply that the articulation of a universal set of human rights would necessarily mean that anyone who doesn't agree is simply wrong, is out of touch with his or her own universal human rights, and therefore needs to be corrected, or at least is inferior in certain ways. Along the lines of this logic, universal human rights would be a form of cultural imperialism in which certain understandings of ethics are being universalized in such a way as that they come to repress certain groups. So, for instance, human rights have been charged along those lines, where it has been argued that human rights, as we currently understand them, are to a large extent the product of Enlightenment thinking, with a very, very strong focus on individuals versus the state, and a certain understanding of rationality. And that this kind of thinking that underlies human rights thinking, or the human rights discourse, is inherently Western and fits the self-understanding of Western cultures and communities. But that doesn't mean they automatically apply outside of the West in exactly the same manner. And even if you were to try to avoid putting blueprints of ethics as universals on the globe, but try to go through discourse ethics, try to work through a dialogue, a global dialogue of civil society, how could that dialogue be equal? Right? How could the dialogue between the winners and the losers, the educated versus the non-educated, the rich versus the poor, how could that dialogue actually be an honest and open dialogue? Will that not always be coming with a certain amount, substantial amount of power? Cosmopolitanism in terms would charge communitarianism with moral relativism. If ethics are fundamentally local, they would say, does that mean that anything goes? Can you then justify the oppression of women or practices such as female circumcision by saying, oh, well, that's their culture, those are their ethics? Would that also go for ethnical cleansing or extremely violent practices? It would lead to an understanding of ethics as something equaled with certain local practices, and it would make it very difficult for us to adjudicate conflicts of communities on an ethical basis, because then you would say, yeah, well, each of them just has their own ethics. We'll just have to leave it like that. And also within communitarianism, you would have actually the same kind of problem you would find in cosmopolitanism. Because if ethics are coming out of a community and therefore somehow local, what would happen if people in that community would resist their community's ethics? Once again, then you would say, yeah, well, the community has to say about what is ethical, so then the resistors will just have to acknowledge the primacy of the community. where you have the same kind of situation as in Cosmopolitanism, in which universal human rights repress or oppress local resistance. A final field of analysis that is very prominent in ethical thinking in international relations is the responsibility to protect, or R2P, which is a ethical principle that also is being discussed quite a bit in international law community, leading to a lot of legal and ethical documents and treaties. The idea here is that states, and not just that, actually the international community, has the obligation to help people in need. People that are being oppressed or being incredibly neglected in such a way that there is a humanitarian situation going on that needs addressing. And that responsibility is not something that you can just deny. There's no way around it. We've got a certain responsibility to act. Even if, or rather, better put, especially if this means breaking the law of sovereignty, meaning interfering violently into an other state's affair. Right? So the responsibility to protect is an ethical principle guiding the decision to act violently towards a state that abuses the rights of its own citizens. Here, several puzzles apply as well. First of all, it may be incredibly difficult to assess who needs protection from who. In recent conflicts, we have seen, for instance, in Libya a couple of years back, a situation of a civil war in which we can certainly identify certain actors that we find ethically dubious, but we find lots of violence and human rights abuses on both sides of the conflict. Who do you then protect? How do you make an assessment of who to support? Right. The second problem that arises with the responsibility to act is the consequentialist puzzle of what happens if we interfere. Right. Sometimes military interference, military intervention, can aggravate the situation of those who are already suffering. It can actually make the conflict worse, make it perpetuate itself, and also can create a whole new category of victims, namely the troops that you send to actually help others. So, in many ways, interference can actually make the human rights situation worse instead of better. How to assess that is not a simple matter. For instance, it's often been cited that in the case of the Rwandan genocide in 1994, in which one part of the population massively slaughtered the other part of the population, the international community should have acted and much faster and much more decisively than they end up doing. And from the perspective of public outrage, that is completely understandable, but given the fact that the whole country was in a state of local war, in which in each village where people were massacred, a military intervention would have implied sending tens of thousands of soldiers to every part of the country, which is a huge country, leading to all kinds of unforeseen, uncontrollable outcomes, violence against those soldiers, etc., etc. So that would be completely unpredictable and very, very dangerous to do. The third puzzle that comes with humanitarian intervention is the question of self-interest. The literature shows that if states intervene on the basis of humanitarian crisis, usually it has a strong relation with their own interest as well. Not that states only use humanitarian intervention for their own purposes, but they also count them in their analysis of the situation. This can take different forms. One of them is, of course, to sort of, in a very instrumentalist way, further your own economic and political gains in the region, for instance, by grasping oil or other resources. But it could also be the way in which you end up intervening to begin with. Think about the way in which we changed from sending soldiers on the ground to simply bombing stuff from the air, which is so much safer for us and therefore much more convenient and much more legitimate in our public opinion, but leads to a certain kind of warfare in which certain kinds of goals can be achieved but others certainly can't. So it might as well have negative outcomes. And finally, there's a puzzle of how much harm can you do when helping others, right? So if you would have to stop a dictator from performing ethnic cleansing, as was the puzzle in the 1990s, in which the United Nations tried to stop Serbia from committing ethnic cleansing towards Kosovo, is it actually justifiable to then bomb a city like Belgrade? If you know that this bombing of a city like of Belgrade will definitely cost human civilian lives of innocent people, right? Are you allowed to actually commit human rights abuses while protecting human rights? In order to work through these puzzles, the doctrine of double effect has been developed, which is basically arguing that, well, it is justifiable to use a certain kind of violence in the enactment of responsibility to protect, but only if that violence is not the purpose of your action. So only that violence isn't central to what you want to achieve. If it's just peripheral, if it's residual of what you want. So if your intention is good and you take a risk of hurting innocent people, but that is not what your military goal is, under that circumstance, the doctrine of double effect would say that your actions can be justified. Okay, some questions to ponder. Ethics is really popular as a way of studying world politics nowadays. Normative theory has grown a lot of attention, and ethical puzzles are very much on the front of academic and political thinking. However, you could ask yourself that question of its relevance, in the sense that the way we describe ethical puzzles now seems to be very abstract, very far from local experience practice. Isn't this ethical pondering about issues in a rational way something like a mind game for the middle class? To what extent is this actually relevant? Secondly, when we perform actions, when we do stuff, how carefully do we actually weigh the ethical implications of our actions? If you take the categorical imperative, in which we should only act in such a way that we would want that to be the rule for such situations, is that actually doable? Would that that actually lead to a sort of a continuous pondering and puzzling about the ethical consequences of our behavior? Wouldn't that just be too complicated? Can we actually do that? So, to what extent can we include ethical reasoning in our decision making in world politics? And thirdly, this discussion about human rights being universal or non-universal. Is there any way of telling whether it is or not? And if not, what does that say about human rights? What does it say about ethics in world politics? And how can we proceed from a stalemate situation between the cosmopolitanist and the communitarian perspective? And finally, what would be worse? Standing by when people suffer, or intervening for egoistic reasons? And do we have access to an alternative to either of these two?